stories of Hollywood, somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Hello again. Welcome back to Between the Dial, a project dedicated to plotting a roadmap straight through the dark heart of Los Angeles with the hopes of uncovering the secret histories that inform those Tinseltown dreams. I'm Dan Watkins, before I get too ahead of myself, and by now I'm sure you're all caught up and you've listened to quite a lot of me talking about the dark history of this country's movie makers. And I promise you will hear a lot more of that, but I would be remiss if I did not address the origins of the art form. And it's an origin that is not without its own controversy and scandal. So, conventional wisdom has put forth two basic and slightly competing narratives surrounding the invention of cinema. One was that it was invented by Thomas Edison, and the other is that it was invented by the Lumiere brothers. Well, first off, it's important to clarify that Thomas Edison had little to do with the kinetoscope, which was his early cinema exhibition device. The kinetoscope was largely developed by William Kennedy Dixon while in the employ of Thomas Edison. Second, who the father of cinema is really comes down to what you consider cinema. Edison/Dixon's machine consisted of a series of photographs strung together that, when cranked through the viewer, created the illusion of movement. It was invented in 1891. It was, however, a single viewer experience. The Lumiere machine was a combination movie camera and movie projector that allowed for the group viewing experience that we more closely associate with modern cinema. It premiered in 1895 in Paris. Now, sandwiched in between those two canonical fathers of cinema are two people who have more or less been lost to history. The first name is Eugene Augustin Laust, who developed a method using Edison's kinetoscope technology and projecting it for public viewing. And he did so in a demonstration in New York City several months before the Lumiere brothers. His name is lost mainly due to patent disputes with Edison and the fact that his films were of a poorer quality than the others. Now, the second forgotten father of cinema is where things start to get back to the theme of this podcast. His name is Louis Le Prince, and he was quite possibly the actual first person to shoot a moving picture sequence using a single lens camera and a strip of paper film. He built his own proprietary motion picture camera and used it to film Round Hay Garden Scene on October 14th, 1888. At the same time, not an hour and a half away in Whitechapel, Jack the Ripper was carving his own path to immortality. Fun fact. Anyway, to this day, Roundhay Garden Scene remains the oldest surviving moving film. Edison and a slew of others had been racing to create the first successful motion picture camera, and LaPrince had actually cracked it. And after spending a little time perfecting his invention, LaPrince set a course for the United States in 1890 for the first public exhibition of his work. His wife and children, who had been living there for 3 years, had arranged a theater for the first public screening of his film. So he packed up his device and first headed to France, where he was from, to visit his brother and tie up a few business affairs. They met up in Dijon, visited, and then LaPrince boarded a train to Paris to visit with a few friends. It seems as though he was on a bit of a farewell tour, you'd say, seeing all the people he needed to see before relocating across the ocean. So he headed to Paris, but he boarded a later train that he had meant to because he was just having so much fun with his brother that he got a late start. So when he arrived in Paris, he was unable to meet the friends he was wanting to visit. In fact, he wouldn't meet up with anyone ever again, as far as we know, because upon arriving in Paris, he was never seen or heard from again. He simply vanished. He was last seen by his brother boarding the train in Dijon. He was ultimately declared dead in 1897. In 1890, a body was pulled from the Seine that strongly resembled LaPrince, leading some to believe that he may have committed suicide. The reasons for which were speculated to have been that his machine simply didn't work. But the Roundhay Garden Scene would suggest otherwise. Anyway, thank you for listening to me talk about the origins of cinema. But here in Los Angeles, there is another big industry that exists alongside the motion pictures: the defense industry. So to complete the holistic picture of the city, I think it's equally pertinent to discuss the origins of that one as well, and how they both intersect with another one of LA's major industries: occultism. Los Angeles' defense industry hit its boom years in the 1950s and 60s during the height of the Cold War, but it began in the 1930s with rockets. And you can't talk about rockets, or at least you shouldn't talk about rockets, without talking about Jack Parsons. Parsons, along with his childhood friend Ed Foreman, conducted rudimentary rocket tests in the Arroyo Seco, right there in the shadow of the Colorado Street Bridge in Pasadena, as early as 1934. They soon joined up with Caltech, and using Caltech's resources, Jack Parson was able to invent the first castable composite rocket propellant. And he co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. There, he would be instrumental in the development of both liquid and solid rocket fuel. Needless to say, Jack Parsons loved rockets. But he had other interests as well. Interests that would set him at odds with the conventional morality of the time. Parsons had always been an open-minded kind of guy. One curious about the fringes. For instance, he was openly socialist, smoked marijuana, loved reading and writing science fiction, so in 1939, when he and his wife, Helen, were asked by a couple of friends, a brother and sister duo named John and Frances Baxter, if they would be interested in attending something called a thelemic mass at a place called the Agape Lodge in Hollywood. They agreed without hesitation. And that's why I'm currently standing here, at 1746 Winona Boulevard. The home that once housed the Agape Lodge has since been demolished, and in its place is an apartment building. In fact, the entire street is lined with apartment buildings. And it's actually pretty quiet, considering its surroundings. That home that the Baxters invited Parsons to was owned by Wilfred Talbot Smith, who was the North American head of the Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, which, for those of you who are uninitiated, is a hermetic magical organization founded at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's all you really need to know about its origins. Wilfred Smith was appointed by fellow British occultist Aleister Crowley, who assumed control of the organization, at least on an international level, in 1925, and subsequently proclaimed that Thelema, a religion that Crowley founded in the early 1900s, to be the guiding principle of the OTO. So, did y'all get all that? Sorry, I don't mean to get so in the weeds with occultism. I realize that for those who aren't mired in this stuff, that it can just sound like an endless stream of nonsense words and acronyms. And the thing is that is all very much by design. I mean, the term occult means hidden knowledge, so the authors of occult texts are given to deliberately obfuscating the meanings of their writing under nonsense word salad, for lack of a better, and that's all to strengthen the barrier of entry for the neophytes, as they call them. Basically, to pursue it, you really have to want it. And to understand it, you need to put in the effort to decipher it. Additionally, there is not enough time to get into the truly fascinating life of Aleister Crowley, but he is a character that will no doubt weave his way in and out of future stories, because he truly is one of the secret architects of the world we live in today. But back to the present. Personally, I come to these places to try to soak up any residual energy they may hold, but it feels like there really isn't much left here on Winona Boulevard. Indeed, in the intervening years, once Parsons became involved in the Agape Lodge, he successfully usurped control of the lodge and relocated it to his far more lavish home, a craftsman home on Millionaires Row in Pasadena. So back we go to the east side, 1003 South Orange Grove Boulevard, to yet another place that has long been demolished. Parsons' former home, which he dubbed hilariously the Parsonage, used to stand right here, and it's where he invited all manner of societal outcasts to live communally and practice magic within its walls, in exchange for $100 a month in rent, and much to the chagrin of his neighbors. One such boarder was a young, red-haired writer recently discharged from the army by the name of Lafayette. He joined Jack Parsons in his sex magic practice, and the two of them would conduct rituals at the mouth of the Devil's Gate Dam. Rituals meant to invoke Babylon, the Scarlet Woman who would, according to Crowley, ultimately give birth to the Antichrist. Lafayette, more popularly known now as L. Ron Hubbard, would later disavow his time at the parsonage when it would come time for him to launch his own belief system, which he called Dianetics, which of course was the precursor to Scientology. Think of Dianetics as the thelema to Scientology's OTO, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, then I encourage you to re-listen to this episode as many times as you need to. Anyway, when Hubbard would walk away from the parsonage after stealing a great deal of Jack's financial reserves, he would also do so with Helen's sister Sarah, whom Parsons was also sleeping with. Hubbard and Sarah would eventually marry, despite the fact that Hubbard was already married to a woman named Margaret Grubb. Sarah was a devout Thelemite during her time with Parsons and took an active role in the rituals in the house, despite the fact that she was often defiant and divisive within temple workings. Crowley actually once called her a vampire, which I think is interesting. Sarah would become instrumental in the development of Dianetics, becoming Hubbard's personal auditor, meaning she was the one to whom he told all of his deepest and darkest secrets and insecurities. The two of them together would develop systems of thought that have gone on to inform the lives of thousands of adherents, as well as the cultural landscape of the 20th century and beyond, due to the powerful acolytes that they still hold in their ranks. In Los Angeles, Scientology has also shaped a fair amount of the cityscape of Hollywood due to the impressive real estate holdings in their portfolio. Parsons, however, did not fare as well in the immediate aftermath of his time with Hubbard. He was financially devastated because of the money that Hubbard stole, and at work, his extracurricular activities at the parsonage were catching up to him. With World War II raging, JPL was getting into the burgeoning rocket defense industry, and with that came increased visibility into their operation. It didn't look too appealing to the G-men that one of the founding members of this company, pulling in sizable government contracts, was an open communist who, in his spare time, was engaging in sex magic in an attempt to invoke the Antichrist. Because of all of this, his security clearance was downgraded, and his day-to-day ties with JPL were more or less severed. Though not all was lost for Jack Parsons, because he did find his Scarlet Woman. Shortly after the beginning of the Babylon working, Parsons decamped to the Mojave Desert due to what he describes as an inordinate amount of poltergeist activity in the parsonage. Working with Hubbard as his scribe, Parsons completed the final act of the working. While they were gone, a woman named Marjorie Cameron came to live at the parsonage. She had striking red hair, and you can see how when Jack returned, he made the connection. In need of money and dogged by constant FBI surveillance, Jack Parsons went to work for a company making explosives for the motion picture industry. though he was often given to working from home, which naturally meant storing and mixing extremely volatile and combustible elements on the first floor of their townhome. Marjorie and Jack were preparing for a trip out of the country, with the hopes of kickstarting Parsons' rocket career with the foreign government, when he received a rush commission for film explosives. It was in the course of fulfilling this last-minute job that Jack Parsons would die in an explosion. An explosion likely caused when he dropped a coffee can full of mercury fulminate. The blast decimated the bottom floor of their home, in addition to severing one of Parsons' forearms and blowing off half of his face. Despite his injuries, he was alive when he was discovered by nearby tenants. Though perhaps apocryphal, his last words were said to have been, "I wasn't done." Jack Parsons would die with his contributions to JPL largely scrubbed from its history. JPL, which was established by him and his co-founders on Halloween night in 1936, is now owned by NASA, and has been instrumental in nearly all of the operation's Mars exploration missions.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
Marjorie Cameron didn't buy the accidental explosion theory, and believed for years that her husband had been assassinated. She went on to become a well-respected poet and painter, as well as live an absolutely fascinating life. After Parsons died, Cameron left for Mexico, where she began to perform blood rituals in hopes of contacting her dead husband. She then returned to California and attempted suicide. While in recovery, she bounced around a few different living situations, including living with the OTO leader once usurped by Jack Parsons, Wilfred Talbot Smith, and his wife. Though they found the situation untenable due to her increasingly deteriorating mental state. From there, she drifted to a derelict ranch in Beaumont, California, where she was able to attract a clique of magical practitioners which she dubbed the Children. Intentionally recruiting members of various races, she oversaw a range of sex magic rituals with the intent of creating a breed of mixed-race, quote, moon children, who would be devoted to the Egyptian god Horus. The group was, however, short-lived, as many of the members became disturbed by Marjorie's increasingly apocalyptic visions, in which she foresaw the nuclear destruction of California, followed by a comet that would wipe out life as they knew it. But fear not, she said, because there would be a flying saucer that would rescue the members of the Children from destruction. Throughout her life, she ran through many circles, from the Los Angeles avant-garde to the ufologists to members of the burgeoning New Hollywood movement. She lived for a time in San Francisco, collaborated with Kenneth Anger. She moved to Pioneer Town near Joshua Tree, lived in New Mexico for a bit, but ultimately relocated to a bungalow in West Hollywood with her daughter on Genesee Boulevard. Not a great part of town during those years, but it was here that she would remain until her death in 1995 at the age of 73 from cancer. Marjorie was given her last thelemic rites by a high priestess of the OTO, and she was cremated. Her ashes were then scattered in the Mojave Desert, where Jack Parsons's were 43 years earlier. So we will end their story there, with the two of them mixing with the dust and the wind, occasionally colliding with one another every time the nuclear light lights up the sky. It's kind of beautiful when you think about it, isn't it? Much like Marjorie Cameron, Louis LePrince's wife, Sarah, suspected foul play in what befell her husband as well. For years, his wife and children suspected that he was murdered by his many competitors and creative rivals, the biggest of which was, of course, Thomas Edison. 7 years after his disappearance, Edison and his team of ruthless lawyers dragged LePrince's name through the courts in a patent war that raged for a decade. Louis's son, Adolphe LePrince, who assisted his father with his invention and starred in Roundhay Garden Scene, testified on his behalf, but it would prove to be insufficient. Eventually, the American courts acknowledged Edison as the inventor of motion pictures and dismissed the validity of all of LePrince's work. Adolphe LePrince would die shortly after in 1901 on New York City's Fire Island of a gunshot wound to the head. Though suspicious, his death was ruled a suicide. Though we wrapped things up with a little bit of New York state of mind, I am still standing here on Genesee Boulevard in Hollywood, where Marjorie Cameron spent her final years raising her daughter, caring for her grandchildren, smoking weed, and practicing magic. If that's not a sweet way to go, then I don't know what is. So this is where I have to leave you this week, but next week let's stay in Hollywood because I want to tell you about a good old-fashioned Hollywood murder mystery. That's the only hint. So I will see you then. Have a good night, everyone, and of course, as always, drive safely. Between the Dial was written and produced by me, Daniel Watkins. If you can't get enough of me talking or scary stories, then Christina Santa Cruz and I host horror movies every Wednesday night in October and November. It's a project we're calling Monster Hump Day. It's a lot of fun. Head on over to landturtlerecords.com to check out that and all the other stuff we do. That's landturtlerecords.com. And if you want to follow me on social media for whatever reason, then I am Epcot Fitzgerald on Instagram. That's Epcot_Fitzgerald. Have a good night, y'all.